Hello, everyone. This is a little bit different than I think a lot of us were expecting to come back to, but let's go ahead and let's do our best to make the best of things effectively, and continue talking about a subject that, honestly, I really love a lot. Social psychology is something that is probably the main subject matter that is interesting to me within psychology in and of itself, because it studies how not only how we relate to one another, but how we relate to the different situations that we are put in. How do those situations affect us? And how do we affect the situations, and how do the situations affect us, basically? Let's go ahead and let's get started talking about Module 74 and 75, which Module 74 specifically talks about attribution, attitudes, and actions, and then Module 75 talks specifically about conformity and obedience. So, social psychology, there are certain branches in psychology that look at how people behave in situations. And one of these is personality psychologists, which we will get into personality psychology as we get closer to the end of the year. But in order to just kind of clarify right now, personality psychologists look specifically at the person to explain why different people act differently, even in the same situations. Social psychologists instead look more towards the situation. They aim to understand how that same person may act differently in different situations. So a personality psychologist will look at the same situation, say somebody in line at the grocery store, for example, and will ask, okay, why did people behave differently in the same situation, in the same social context? Why did one person not get their wallet out until the very end of the transaction, whereas another person may have already been digging their wallet out, may have already been pulling out whatever cash or card they needed before they even made it to the checkout line, even with like 3 or 4 people ahead of them? Personality psychologists will look specifically at the person to understand if this is simply just a difference in the personality of the person. Maybe it's because that person is more anxious than another person, for example. Social psychologists instead look specifically at the situation that the person is in. We want to know what in a situation may influence behavior. So, if a person, for a situation like, say, the grocery store, would the same person act differently if the cashier were to just up and leave, compared to, say, if the cashier stayed in the same position? We want to understand how society and how social pressures change our responses. And in effect, do the specifics of a situation change our response? One of the ways that we don't really think about a situation changing our behavior is whenever it comes to attribution theory, which was developed by Fritz Heider in 1958. Fritz Heider proposed the attribution theory in that we attribute behavior either to a person's enduring traits, which is a dispositional attribution, or to the situation itself, which is a situational attribution. Basically, whenever it comes to attributing why someone acted that way, we will either say, oh, it's because of the way that person is, or because of the situation that they were put into. Oh, they acted rudely because people around them were being rude. Rude would be a very situational attribution of why that person may have behaved in a rude manner. Oh, that person was rude, they're always rude, would be a dispositional attribution. If we believe that person is always rude, then we will likely brush off that behavior as just a part of their disposition. Now, we do this unconsciously. We do this without thinking. And that's in effect where a thing called the fundamental attribution error takes place. Because such attributions are sometimes valid, because people do have enduring personality traits. We have learned this in other discussions, that our personality traits even if they tend to shift a bit, tend to be enduring. But the fundamental attribution error begins because we overestimate the influence of personality and underestimate the influence of situations. Whenever it comes to attributing a person's behavior to something, we will tend to attribute that more to a person's individual personality than the social factors around them, and that is the fundamental attribution error. That misstep of assuming that the way that a person behaves is more in their personality rather than in the potential social factors. For example, you may believe that I am very outgoing. However, you've only known me in one context. That may be a fundamental attribution error at that point, because you're attributing an outgoing personality more to my character than to say the social situation of having to be outgoing to lead a classroom. Although I am personally very outgoing, but anyway. The primary people who showed us that this fundamental attribution error is something that we tend to unconsciously do were two psychologists named David Neapolitan and George Goethals, who conducted a study in 1979 that demonstrated the fundamental attribution error. They had students in a college setting talk one at a time with a young woman who had either acted cold or critical or warm and friendly. Now here's the thing. Before the talks, the researchers effectively divided up the students into two groups and had either half the students be told that the woman's behavior would be spontaneous, that woman's behavior would be just based upon them talking, or the other half were told the truth, that she had been instructed to act friendly or unfriendly. This telling actually didn't affect the way that we attributed her behavior in this study. The students would attribute her behavior to her personality even if they knew that her behavior was being faked. If the woman acted friendly, both groups decided that she was really a warm person. And if she acted unfriendly, both groups would decide that she was a cold person. Even whenever they were told, they attributed her behavior to her disposition, even when it was situational. We all commit the fundamental attribution error without realizing it with other people. But we also conduct this error in and of ourselves. This error tends to occur more, we found, in individualistic and Western cultures, a little off topic, rather than in more collectivist Eastern cultures, in which we tend to see a lot more sensitivity to the power of a situation that the person is in. But regardless, this error tends to also occur more in reflections to others' behaviors than our own, but we do see similar errors being made. One of these being self-serving bias. We're more sensitive to how our behavior changes with the situation. We can see in areas where it's a little bit more like, oh, I'm behaving like this because this person treated me badly. That may give me an excuse to also act badly. We're more sensitive to how our behavior changes to the situation. It's not my fault I acted badly. She started yelling at me, type of a deal. It's a self-serving bias. But whenever it comes to how likely we are to commit the fundamental attribution error, we're most likely to commit it whenever we're observing a stranger that we do not know. When we're observing a stranger, we're more likely to attribute their behavior to their personality. This is less likely the more we know the person, although this still can happen. Even reflecting on our own past self changes our perspective. Our present self more so adopts an observer's perspective and attributes our past behavior to the traits that we had at that point in time. Interestingly enough. So not only are we vulnerable to this type of error in the present, we're also vulnerable to this error in the past. So let's talk about attitudes and actions. Actions real quick. So attitudes specifically are feelings. They're often influenced by our beliefs, and they predispose our reactions to objects, people, and events. If we believe that someone is threatening, for example, if we have an attitude that someone may be threatening, we may feel fear and anger towards that person. We may act defensively. And it's important for us to realize how our attitudes affect the way we act, and how the way we act affects our attitudes. Because both attitudes and actions tend to overlap whenever it comes to how we behave. As we were talking about on the slides, attitudes do affect actions. Our attitudes towards a concept reflect our actions. And when it comes to persuasion, there's two primary ways that we can persuade people. The first is a more peripheral route persuasion. This persuasion doesn't engage systematic thinking. It produces fast results as people respond to things like incidental cues. So, this type of persuasion isn't based in argumentation. This persuasion is more based in what is surrounding, what is trying to influence us. Your book gives the example of a perfume ad with images of beautiful or famous people using the product, in that we know that, or we have this idea that those people are good. Therefore, the product that they are using must also be good. And it does tend to produce a incidental cue within us, or a snap judgment within us, that product may be better than, say, another product that wasn't influenced or advertised by a famous person. Central route persuasion is what most people would understand persuasion to be. It's offering evidence and arguments that aim to trigger more favorable thoughts about a specific concept. Central route persuasion occurs more in people that are naturally analytical, or in those who are deeply involved with an issue. This is where you're going to see, this is the type of persuasion you'll see a lot of different types of advocates use to try to have you care about an issue, to try to have you act in favor or against a specific issue, try to influence you to their side, that type of a deal. However, it's important to realize that there are certain things that do influence this relationship between attitude and action. Things like the situation also influence behavior. Things like strong social pressures can weaken this attitude-behavior connection. If there is strong social pressure to act a certain way, even if our attitude is one way, we may act in a different way. Now, this may cause cognitive dissonance, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's important for us to note that just even strong social pressures for or against an action can, even if we think the opposite, can make it to where we don't act in favor of what we believe. But whenever it comes to attitudes affecting behavior, attitudes are most likely to affect behavior when the external influences of a situation are minimal, meaning that there's no strong social pressures, there's no real demands within the situation, and when attitudes are stable specific to that behavior, and are easily recalled. If you see a diagram or an ad telling you to wash your hands and describing specifically how to do so, your attitude towards washing your hands may change, and you may find yourself actually washing your hands more and following the guide that you were seeing consistently. This type of persuasion, this type of small persuasion, can change attitudes towards a situation, and also change behavior. Now let's talk about actions affecting attitudes, because interestingly enough, our actions affect what we believe. The actions that we take in real life affect what we end up believing the most heavily in. So not only will people stand up for what they believe, they'll believe more strongly in what they have had to previously stand up for. Attitude does follow behavior. But behavior does follow attitude in a way. They are kind of rotating, they're effectively continually rotating. Not only do attitudes affect our actions affect our attitude towards a concept. One way that this can be influenced, and that is we have seen in psychology, is what is known as the foot in the door phenomenon. The foot in the door phenomenon is specifically known as the tendency for people who have first agreed to a smaller request to comply later with a larger request. The reason why it's called the foot in the door phenomenon is because it's a lot more easy to interact with somebody if you can just get your foot in the door effectively, if you can get any form of ground to really talk to them, right? Even if it is something that is against your beliefs, getting you to agree to do something small could potentially have you comply later with a larger request. It will make you more likely to do that larger request because you completed that smaller request. If somebody asks you to fill out your contact information and you do so, you may be more likely to fill out that survey that they send you, that short survey that they send you in a week. Then once you fill out that short survey they send you in a week, you may be more likely to fill out that very long survey that they send you in about a month, because that company that had you give their contact information and give you that survey, that like short survey at the beginning, used that foot in the door phenomenon. none. They built up to that large request. A trivial act makes the next one easier for you to complete. Now, what's also interesting is, within this actions affecting attitudes, is the way that adopting a role affects our attitude, our attitudes towards certain behaviors. So, a role is a set of expectations or societal norms about a social position, defining how those in that position ought to behave. Whenever you adopt a new role, a high school student, a college student, whatever role you're adopting, you tended to strive to follow a social prescription based upon that role. And that social prescription is what has been taught to you as the characteristics of said role. A mother is loving to her children and make sure that there's dinner on the table and things like that are common social prescriptions for the role of a mother in a Western society. At first, whenever you're taking on a role initially, the behavior may feel unnatural because you're acting in what you know that role to entail. But after a while, that role becomes completely natural. After a while, that role becomes a part of your identity almost. You stop play acting, and it just becomes an integrated part of your identity as you start to adapt to the new social prescriptions, or you start to figure out, okay, these social prescriptions aren't actually relevant to my role. So these are just two ways that our conducting actions actually do affect our attitudes towards different concepts. Let's go ahead and talk about cognitive dissonance, because cognitive dissonance is interesting. So cognitive dissonance in particular, and cognitive dissonance theory, originates from when we become aware that our attitudes and actions don't entirely coincide. When we realize that these attitudes and actions don't coincide, we experience what's known as tension or cognitive dissonance. A lot of cognitive dissonance comes from how responsible we feel for our actions. So if we feel like we have been coerced into doing something that we may not agree with, we'll feel much less cognitive dissonance because we have the excuse of, oh, they forced me to do it. However, whenever we have a choice, if we feel responsible for how we acted, even if we know that it's different from the way that we act, the more dissonance we feel, the more tension we feel, the more anxiety we'll feel. In order to reduce dissonance, some people will actually end up kind of revising their memories, changing their attitude to reduce this dissonance. And by revising their memories, they may try to write their memories off as more, oh, I ended up being coerced, I didn't mean to do it, it was an accident type of deal. Or they may change their attitude entirely. Hello, kitten. Oh, that's one thing. I apologize. During this whole thing while we're switching to video lectures for the moment, I have kittens in the house. So you may hear the kittens at the door. So if you hear scratching, I apologize. It is the kitten. If you hear like scratching, that's my kittens. I apologize. They are very sweet and very adorable, but they are also sometimes a nuisance. But effectively, we may, in order to reduce that tension, in order to reduce our anxiety whenever it comes to having cognitive dissonance, we may change our attitude towards a concept. If I cheat on a paper accidentally, I may change my viewpoint of my attitude towards cheating to reduce the amount of anxiety I have over doing so. So, for example, now attitude following behavior is very much a double-edged sword. we can't control our feelings, but we can influence them by altering our behavior, as we see with cognitive dissonance. It's very interesting to see, because what we've found is that if we're sad, we can use certain things, such as talking to ourselves in more of a positive, self-accepting way with fewer put-downs towards ourselves. And we can make ourselves almost be happier because we're talking to ourselves in a kinder way. This same effect happens whenever we talk to ourselves in a very negative way. When we talk to ourselves in a very negative way, if we behave in a very negative way, we will feel worse. So our attitude following our behavior, and our behavior following our attitudes, is a double-edged sword. In that, yes, we can, in a way, magnify negative feelings, but we do have the ability to influence them on some level just by changing one such part of it. We can either change our attitude or we can change our behavior. So let's go ahead and flip over to Module 75 and let's start talking about conformity, because as a society, conformity is very interesting. So whenever it comes to social psychology's greatest lesson, the main lesson that you can take away from social psychology, is social psychology's learning that that social influence has an enormous amount of power over us. Humans are very much group individuals. We have always been people who have existed in groups. We've always had a lot of group dynamics whenever it comes to us. When we know how to act, how to groom, how to talk, life functions smoothly, especially whenever we are in a level of being in a society. And those social norms tend to become a form of social influence to us. Now, those social norms can also have certain social pressures to them. And part of how we comply with social pressures is an unconscious repetition of actions seen in the environment called an automatic mimicry. Now, how many of you have been in a group of people and have yawned just because you accidentally catch in your eye seeing another person yawn? How many of you have seen someone looking up at the ceiling in a classroom and then have also looked up at the ceiling? How many of you, upon seeing somebody check their cell phone, have you pulled out your cell phone and checked it? Those are all various examples of automatic mimicry, an unconscious repetition of actions seen in the environment. We tend to take on, much like a lizard, we tend to take on the color of our surroundings. We tend to take on the emotional tones of people around us. And part of this is in the automatic mimicry we have. What people tend to notice is that we're natural mimics. Things in like posture, things like expression, things like vocal tones, we will tend to mimic. It's a way, and this type of mimicking is also known as the chameleon effect. Allowing us to integrate a little bit easier into social situations. Now, this form of mimicry isn't just like a simple, oh, it's kind of interesting thing. This can actually be used to have people react to us more positively. What we found through experimentation is that if a person is mimicking, we tend to feel closer to that person. We tend to regard that person with a lot more positive feelings. Automatic mimicry, in a way, helps us to emphasize, helps us to feel what other people are feeling. If a person is angry and is visibly showing it on their face, we may also, without realizing it, vaguely mirror that person, vaguely or sometimes even purposefully, mirror that person's expression, either because of what they're telling us, or because simply they're upset. This automatic mimicry can also, in a way, help us to explain what's known as mood linkage. What we'll notice is in groups, if one person is upset, some people in the group will actually get more upset. If one person is happy in a group, the group mood will tend to rise. This is known as mood linkage. It's the sharing of both up and down moods within a group. All of these levels of conformity, all of this automatic mimicry, mood linkage, things like that, do tend to evoke feelings of fondness within other people. Of course, this level of automatic mimicry can sometimes lead to things like tragedies, but it's generally this type of conformity and complying isn't done maliciously. Let's talk about conformity and social norms. Conformity primarily involves adjusting our behavior or thinking towards some group standard. Mimicry is just one type of conformity, but there's also suggestibility. Suggestibility being our ability to have things effectively suggested to us repetitively. If somebody says a specific option multiple times, or if we see a certain option multiple times, we're more likely to go ahead and do that. And that's just simply because we've been suggested that option so many times that everybody's like, oh, they've seen that a lot, that must be good. Good, so that's just one form of suggestibility. Whenever it comes to conformity and social norms, there's important things that we have to realize that play into it. When we conform, we tend to conform to either avoid rejection or to gain social approval. In such cases, we're responding to what's known as a normative social influence. This normative social influence is influencing our behavior, and as a result of us wanting to either gain approval within a group or avoid disapproval within a group. We may give a completely wrong answer just because the rest of the group has given the same wrong answer. Just because we don't want to be disapproved of by other people because we gave a different answer from the group. And this leads to what's known as informational social influence, or an influence resulting from one's willingness to accept others' opinions about reality. Sometimes both normative social influence and informational social influence, much like our attitude and actions, tend to influence one another. And we can honestly see how these social influences can adjust our behavior. As human beings, we're especially sensitive to these social norms and influences because we can be greatly punished for varying away from these norms. We can be greatly punished for not responding well to these norms, for not complying with these norms. In some instances, this would result in bullying, but it's just or even things like just slight feelings of being a social outcast, for being different, for not accepting those types of social norms. So it's important to understand how these types of social norms influence us. Oops. So let's talk about obedience. Specifically, whenever we know what we know about obedience, our main understanding of obedience, which is our willingness to give in to social pressures to obey command, basically, was first explored by Stanley Milgram in his experiments ranging from 1963 to about 1974. Stanley Milgram is primarily known for what's known nowadays as the Milgram experiment, which the Milgram experiment was actually 20 experiments, but each experiment involved having a participant and a confederate complete word puzzles. A confederate being a person who is in on the experiment and who is just an actor playing a role. In this experiment, we would have a participant who would be selected to be the teacher, and the confederate would be selected to be the learner in a word puzzle. The teacher would be sat down in front of a machine that was set up to look like it would administer electric shocks. And what the instructor was told was that, what the teacher was told was that if the participant gets the puzzle wrong, they need to be given a slight electric shock. Now and then they would move on to the next electric shock if they got it wrong, and so on and so forth. It would start at 15 volts, then 30, then 45, all the way up to, if I remember correctly, 450 volts. Now, none of these electric shocks were actually given. None of this was real. It was just a fancy machine and a lot of acting. But the participants didn't know this. Notice, they believed that machine would actually shock the person. Once the experiment began, after the 8th switch, which started at 120 volts, the learner would cry out that the shocks were painful. After the 10th switch, he would begin shouting, "Get me out of here, I don't want to be in an experiment anymore. If the participant wanted to stop fully, a experimenter in the room would be asked for them to sit down and continue the experiment. Saying, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue." The experimenter would continue to insist that that participant continues the experiment. The only way that experiment would end is that if the participant refused to go further, fully refused. If the participant were to continue after the 340 volt level, the learner would refuse to answer and fall silent. The experimenter would push you towards the final 450 volt switch. Ask the question, he said, and the experimenter would say, and if no correct answer was given, administer the next shock level. If they said nothing, just give the next level of the shock. How many people continued the experiment after this? Do you think you would refuse to continue? Do you think you would? Or do you think you would continue? Do you think you would listen to the experimenter at that point in time? Well, what Milgram found was that a lot, actually, about 60%, completed the experiment fully. Now, this was the same case even with different variable changed, such as the genders, because initially this was completed with generally white male participants, but Milgram completed the same type of experiment with women changed it up to men ages 20 to 50, changing the age, or changing the situation, saying that the Confederate had a heart condition, we tended to notice a very high response rate for people completing that experiment fully, for people completing that 450 degree or 450 volt switch, for people flipping that switch. The participants also experienced actual distress at having to continue the experiment. What we tended to notice was nervous laughing, sweating. Not a lot of people figured out that it was a hoax. That people actually were in genuine distress over having to complete this. And this experiment was one of many that led to a greater discussion of ethics in psychology. But it also taught us a lot about obedience. It taught us a lot about some of the factors that influence our willingness to obey certain commands. Here's the primary takeaways for when obedience was highest amongst those within the Milgram experiment. There were some common factors that changed how people responded. Obedience was highest when the person giving orders was nearby. If the person was giving orders was in the room, obedience was higher than if that person was, say, out of the room and it was just the teacher within that space. If the person giving orders was perceived to be a legitimate authority, if they were believed to be, say, a scientist, instead of just like an intern, they would have a higher level of obedience if that person, for example, was wearing a lab coat and looked like an actual scientist. If the authority figure was supported by a prestigious institution, obedience was higher than, say, if they were supported by a lesser-known institution. So, like, if a college, like, say, Yale, was doing an experiment, obedience would be higher compared to, say, if St. Petersburg College or University of South Florida were giving that experiment. If the victim was depersonalized, if the victim was obscured in such a way to where they weren't quite treated as a person, or if the victim was at a distance or in another room, obedience was higher in this experiment. The last thing that influenced obedience is not having any role models for defiance. If the teachers did not see any other participant disobey the experimenter, they were less likely to disobey themselves. They were more likely to be obedient towards the situation. But with that, in these experiments and in modern replications, because Stanley Milgram's experiments were replicated, participants were always torn, and they experienced some level of that cognitive dissonance, that tension between what they believed was right and what they felt like they had to do. Should they act, or should they follow their attitude of not hurting another person? And when it came to attitude versus action, the way that the cognitive dissonance was resolved was usually through action, even if that was an action they didn't quite agree with. These experiments demonstrate to us that strong social influences can make people conform to falsehoods, or potentially act in a way that's cruel. It's important to be aware of what is influencing your behavior in these instances. But with that, we've covered everything from Module 74 and 75. Homework will be posted on ThinkWave. So make sure to check that. It should actually be posted in the same assignment that the video that you're watching right now is from. So please go ahead and check that. And stay safe, everyone. I hope you had a really good spring break even with everything going on. Have a good rest of the day.